Anyway, welcome everybody, and especially welcome to Lea Ypi, coming back for, I don't know, third or fourth time here. And we're going to discuss this book, Indignity. And Lea is born in Albania in 1979 and is a professor of politics and philosophy at the London School of Economics, but nowadays at the law school recently. I've moved over there. And before that, you were at Nuffield College and you got your PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, like some of the researchers here. And you have written, you have researched and you have written about normative political theory, democratic theories of justice, Marxism and critical theory, Kant a lot, nationalism, intellectual history, etc., etc. But the thing that really changed everything, you were widely acclaimed as a political philosopher, but the strange thing was when you wrote this other book that I have here, Free. Okay, I will. This book, Free, which became an enormous success all over the world. I think you've been translated to how many languages?
37, that one.
37, that's something. And we might get back to that. I don't know what it's like to write a new book after a success like that. I would be very nervous if I was in that situation. Now this new book, Indignity, A Life Reimagined, is very much about your grandmother Lehman, but also the different strands of your family in all of this geopolitical turmoil that this whole area with Thessaloniki and Tirana and Albania, that whole area happened during the downfall of the Ottoman Empire and other empires, the First World War, the Second World War. Now, I'm going to start by asking you a question about personal identity, actually. So, I wonder, you are, when you write about this, you're worried about what you're going to find. What you're going to find out about your family. And so that made me think about, how much does it matter for your identity what your past family have done and who they are? And I was thinking a little bit the kind of modernity or the kind of social democratic welfare state. One of the things it did was to make us independent of family, make us free as individuals. That's often misunderstood, but it really made individuals free because they didn't need to rely on healthcare, schooling. They didn't need to rely on the family. And that's kind of, one can say, the progressive view of how you're dependent on. You're not really dependent on your past family. Maybe you need to go to therapy because bad things they did to you, but there's nothing more than that. A more classical and perhaps more conservative view on this, which is the one you take up, which might be surprising then, is that you're just one person in the chain made by your family from the past to the future. Like a version of Burke's idea of society. It's a contract between those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are to be born. So, what's your view on this? I'm a bit surprised.
Yeah, good. So, first of all, thank you very much, Gustaf, for having me here again. I was actually here last time to introduce the ideas for this book, which were shaped very much in conversation by researchers here. So, and I'm very grateful to you for inviting me with the finished product and to all of you for being here. And now I'm going to defend myself.
Very good.
So, and actually the first thing I'll say with a joke is that when people ask me what is home for you, I usually say it's Heathrow Terminal 5. Because
that's a nowhere.
Yeah, because either I'm going to Albania or I'm coming and thinking that home is Albania, or coming back from Albania having been disappointed with the fact that I did not find home in Albania and that things have changed so much that they're unrecognizable and therefore the country is not really home. It's more like a former home, and thinking, well, now my home is in Britain. So then I'm coming back and arriving in Heathrow Terminal 5 and thinking, now I'm going home. And then realizing actually it's the United Kingdom and it's not really my language and these people are not really my people and I'm a part of a more complicated whole. So that's kind of my joke answer to what is home. But the more serious answer is that, and I'll answer your question in a slightly roundabout way, by going to my PhD thesis, which was called Statist Cosmopolitanism.
Yes.
And as the first, my PhD thesis that was called Statist Cosmopolitanism and was the first piece of work I wrote about identity in many ways. And that starts with this Diogenes the cynic, the first cosmopolitan, who everyone hates because he goes around saying, I don't care, all countries are the same to me, and they want me to pigeonhole myself, but I don't like this. And the Greeks were not very charitable with Diogenes. They actually trashed him for this position because they said, actually, this is not a good way of being a cosmopolitan. A cosmopolitan shouldn't be someone who sheds responsibility. It should be someone who takes responsibility. And actually, and now this is my position, where you come from does matter for how you take your responsibilities in the world. So I don't have a conservative view in that I think I agree with you. I don't really think I'm determined by my family, my class, my national background. I often get very nervous when people introduce me as Albania's writer. And that's because I have a sort of ambiguous relationship. But on the other hand, although I think philosophically the cosmopolitans are right to say that identity, family, state belonging, national culture, religion, they don't determine who we are, I do think that pragmatically it matters to know the history of where you come from, because that shapes what position you are in thinking about the future and in taking responsibility for the future. And in many ways, for me, discovering and exploring this history of the family and the connections between it and the history of Albania have helped me understand not just the past of Albania, but also what is the role that Albania has in the world now, and what do I, as someone who clearly knows Albania a bit better than, say, Gustaf.
Yes. Which one? The one
we
in the book or
me? We are in a
me?
different position. Yeah, both. Clearly, that means that we are epistemically in a different position to think about our responsibilities and the amount of information that we know, the feelings that we have, the connections that we have. Yeah, they don't determine us, but we do need to know them and to know how we think about them and how we process these very complicated, legacies to actually find our place in the world and to try and change it and shape it in a different way. So I would say that I have a forward-looking view of identity. And for that forward-looking view of identity, actually the past matters as well.
Yeah, you said in a roundabout way, because usually, you're talking about responsibility, and it seems rather, strange if we should be responsible for our ancestors' good or bad actions. But still, there's something there that you're trying to pinpoint that, okay, I didn't do that, but maybe I benefited from it? Is it that?
Well,
because that's hard also to square with this. How do you know that you probably wouldn't have existed? We're going to get into this. So
you benefit in a way, but you also, for me, really, it is about knowledge. So I think I benefited in a way, but there were also losses because maybe there were other things that I missed out on by being from this family and by having this position. But I also think that even if you want to overcome that, even if you think critically about identity, you do need to know with some sense of what are the existing responsibilities and what is the status quo to be able to then think about it in a different direction.
So you wrote this book. I know you're worried about what you're going to find, because you might find something, people were not what you thought they were. But you're not also worried that you might be pulled down in this kind of, the history of things, being weighed down. There's a kind of liberation of, forget about the past. Move forward.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because this comes out very early, both in the book, but also in the process of researching the book. When for people who haven't read the book yet, a lot of it is based on surveillance files of my grandmother held in these communist archives of the Albanian secret police. And when you file a request to see those files, you have to decide whether you apply as a family member or as a researcher. And I applied as a researcher. Because in part, as a result of this concern I had, that if I applied as a family member, both in my head but also in the process, I would be dragged down in a way of thinking about my family and my grandmother, that even though rationally I agree with you, this is not how we should be thinking about family. I don't think there is a part of this belonging and identity and concerns and questions and connections that's not quite rational. You just operate, it acts on you in ways that are not fully you can't really fully articulate from a rational perspective. So I get, for example, really upset when I read things about me in Albania. In a way that if I read things about me in Sweden, not that I get very bad things, but if I were to have critical, I would say, yeah, okay, fine, this is the Swedish public, that's how they process these things. And so it doesn't get to me in this visceral way. And of course, rationally, if you're a cosmopolitan, it just doesn't matter, is it coming from Albania or is it coming from... Or I get really upset if my mom tells me off. In a way in which I don't get upset by other people, It's sort of... So I think there's components to this process that you can't quite anticipate and think about. But in this application form, I said I'm going to apply as a researcher because I felt just that, knowing that, put a distance between me and my grandmother and the file and what I would find and the history of the family, that made me then access this history and write the book in a way that I hope isn't just a granddaughter reflecting about her grandmother's legacy, is also a writer that is trying to think about the broader forces that shaped this life that she encountered in the archive.
No, I think you put it pretty well, that something can, of course, still affect you. You can't get rid of it from your thinking, even if it is a bad argument, because it is kind of strange. And now you made a comparison between family and the nation. But of course, the nation is really a kind of construction. So it's interesting that you get more bothered by, what they write in Albania than somewhere else.
Yeah, I think, a nation, it's the language, it's the processes of socialization, it's education, it's how you think people think about values. And in all my theoretical work, I'm all against it. And politically, I'm also against it. I actually think nation is not a good thing.
That's what I suspected.
And it is a kind of elite construct. And it emerges for contingent reasons in a particular time and a particular configuration of, political processes in the world going in a certain direction that make the nation the institutional response that seems the most appropriate. But I think I think it kind of, maybe for smaller nations, this is more relevant than for larger nations. I don't know. If there is also a scale issue. If you're Albania, you've been drilled in for 100 years with his historiography of victimhood and this poor country that was fighting all these enemies left, right, and center, and they're all trying to suppress you. And actually, even if I didn't care about Albania, when I'm in the UK, people do care about Albanians a lot. And when they see me as an Albanian. So this is why it goes back to this. Of course, it's irrational. But on the other hand, how many Albanians are there in the UK that can take responsibility for dismantling myths around Albanian criminals? So if you go to the far-right rhetoric about Albanians in Britain, they'll say they're all people smugglers, they're all, engaged in traffic. And epistemically, there aren't that many people who are in a position to say, hey, hang on, hi, I'm Albanian, I'm not a people smuggler, I'm actually a nice person. So I think it's sort of these dynamics, there is a sense in which this is why it comes down to responsibility, and this is where both family and nation are in that sense related, I think, in how you think about responsibility.
This segues very well over to my next question, but before that question, you're going to read a little bit about Unmixing.
Well, yeah, I'm going to read about this chapter from this part of the book. Well, a lot of the book is about the complexity of identity. And a lot of it is also about how nations are constructed, and in particular how they are constructed in the aftermath of the collapse of empires, and how nationalism in the Balkans has played this role. So this is from very early in the book. It's from a scene that is in Thessaloniki, Salonika, Ottoman city that then becomes a Greek city, and where in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there is a population exchange of Greeks and Turks that is decided by a treaty called the Lausanne Treaty, that's prescribing this population exchange. And this is about how Albanians in Salonika are caught, they're Muslim but not Turks, they're not forced to go to Turkey, they can choose where to stay. So this is a part of the book that tries to talk a little bit about this process of unmixing of peoples. This is a phrase from Lord Curzon, who used this sentence to talk about the process of creating a new institutional order after the collapse of the empires that were cosmopolitan and multicultural. And now you have this new nation-state principle that requires the unmixing of peoples. What are you? Dr. Elias's words echoed in her head. Was she Leman Leskoviku or Ibrahim Bey? Was she a boy or a girl? Was she Greek or Turkish or Albanian? And in all this, why did she speak French? A few weeks ago, her aunt Selma had told her about a place in Switzerland where people communicated in French, just like them, just like all the noble families in the Ottoman Empire, and where in the summer one could swim in a lake called Leman, just like her, a city called Lausanne where important people had a year or so ago gathered to sign a document needed to make peace after the war. But why did they not sign it before the war started so they didn't have to fight? Leman had asked, and Selma just shrugged. In any case, that document, her aunt had said, once it was signed, well, it told everyone what they were and where they were supposed to live, and depending on what they called themselves, this could be very different from where they had lived before, which was why the port had been so busy in the last few months, because there was a looming deadline to complete the population exchange. It was also why everyone on the streets was asking each other if and when they were leaving, whether by any chance they had anything to sell beforehand, and if they had found space on the steamer boats. But Leman also thought about the deafening silence that had greeted the doctor's question. What are you? And how about her father, who had pushed her from his lap just when he was asked to answer it, as if it made him uncomfortable or even angry, as if it was her fault that he didn't know how to respond. She also remembered her aunt's vain attempts to reassure her that she, Leman, had nothing to be afraid of. They were Albanian, of course they were. But since they had never lived in Albania before, they weren't exactly like the other Albanians across the mountains, because unlike those Albanians, in her family they had Greek papers. And when they traveled, everyone thought they were Greek. And they spoke Greek, just like the Greeks. It had not helped. Leman knew that they weren't the same kind of Greek as the other Greeks, since they celebrated Eid and not Easter. And for Eid they invited Dr. Elias, who always came unless it was a Saturday, and reminisced about the old days. In those days, before the fire of Salonika, he would say how the Canaries sang as loudly as the Imam of Hamza Bey Mosque, but when the mosque's minaret was removed, the birds singing became sad. Leman sometimes wondered if that was really the case. To her, the Canaries always sounded cheerful. Even if one of the 100 birds died, it went unnoticed. The remaining 99 just sounded the same. Perhaps it was Dr. Elias who had become sad, she thought. But now she understood that there were others who celebrated Eid. People like Omer, the street vendor, who was not lucky enough to be able to call himself Albanian, who was a Turk and simply had to leave because that's what those gentlemen on the lake had decided. Were they the same gentlemen who had invited her father to give his views? What if her father, instead of answering their question, had rolled his eyes in embarrassment and counted his beads? What if the subcommittee, now she knew exactly what it meant, did not believe a single one of his answers? She could feel her heart pounding, and her knees started to shake. The more she thought about it, the more afraid she felt that she might soon become the same as Omer and his family, away from her home, from the Canaries, from Salonique la Magnifique, packed up on a boat like the jars of leeches in Omer's sack to travel God knows where. She left the veranda and ran inside the house. She looked first in the drawing room, stopping before the large portrait of her grandfather, Ibrahim Pasha, admiring his distinguished pose, the grave look on his face, the deep blue eyes with their distant look that made it impossible to gauge his emotions, the grey hair that contrasted with the dark red of the fez. Everything in the painting was designed to fill the observer with awe and respect. Yet, even if that man who had fought all his life to save the great Sultan of the great Ottoman Empire, if even Ibrahim Pasha could not have answered the question of the subcommittee or stopped the lakeside delegation, what hope was there for lowly people like her, not important enough to have their own portraits painted?
I mean, that passage illustrates a lot of things, but one thing it illustrates, and connecting to our early discussion, is how your identity is pushed upon you from the outside. because people want to classify you, or treaties are going to classify you, and all this kind of thing. We can't really withstand that. And there's also another scene in the book where your grandfather Aslan, when he's behaving like a good citizen and waiting in line, and then the official there is very annoying and delaying everything, and then he realized that this is Ypi, and then he was very afraid. He felt like he was tricked. Then, because he is of course from this family where his father in turn was very high up. I mean, he was the prime minister. So that part of being kind of classified and generating this kind of thing, that is something also that comes with modernity a lot. And causes this kind of catastrophes. I mean, you're illustrating this geopolitical catastrophe going on in this whole area.
Yeah, and I think
No.
it's the first time someone is not telling me I'm fast, but you, that's
It
very
had
nice.
happened before.
So I think it's interesting because I think it's in these moments of crisis where you can somehow question all the things that we take for granted. So this passport is a recent invention. People didn't have passports. There's a character in my book who is an archivist who at some point when I went to the archive to search for my grandmother's life, and I said, is there no identity document or anything I can pull out from these archives? And she says, in those days, people were like birds. They were just traveling around and they didn't need this documentation. But these moments of crisis, I think, are really useful to actually challenge identity, because in this transition from the empire to the creation, for example, of these Balkan nation states, that's where you really see one identity replacing another. So if you try to question now national identity in Albania, and actually also national historiography, the story of the 20s is the story of people who go because they were all so patriotic that they wanted to build the new state that has just been created. But if you actually look at the layers of history, you discover that this is the Albanian state in the future, so afterwards, telling a story about itself that was not necessarily the story that was there to begin with. And I think these moments of crisis are of transition from one world to another, this transition from the imperial world to the new nation-state world in the Balkans, is really useful to see that these narratives, in the name of which people have been killing each other in the 90s, as late as the 90s. I mean, think about Yugoslav wars. This was 91, 92. All in the name of nationalism. You go back 100 years and you realize that it's just some subcommittee that decided by treaty that this is what you're called and this is who you are and this is your identity. And now we're killing on behalf of these peoples.
This was the first time one had this idea of unmixing of people. I don't know about an earlier occasion that the idea that, okay, we're going to solve the problem by pulling people apart and classify them in one and the other way.
Yeah, I don't know if this was in the, I think it's because the question there is the new nationalism, which is why nationalism was progressive when it was fighting against the empire. So if you think about the French Revolution, this idea of citizenship and nationality was there to challenge the cosmopolitan of the imperial elite. So, the Ancien regime was cosmopolitan and spoke different languages and had no borders and so on. And nationalism is democratizing force at that point. Now, nationalism has become the model, and you're a few decades later in this new context in which this is now the model. So what do? We create new nation states, because this is how are we going to unsettle the empire. And of course, the question there is, was there a counterfactual way of democratizing the empire? It's a counterfactual whereby instead of breaking up the empire and unmixing the peoples, you democratize it. And so you open up to participation and you create these structures that just in the way in which you've democratized the state somehow. But I think this is interesting, counterfactual that was not available, because the League of Nations and the principles of the League of Nations were very much the principles that had emerged from the French Revolution. And some of these characters, in fact, some people would say the Ottoman Empire might not have collapsed if the elite was not so obsessed with the French Revolution. Because they had this idea that they needed to modernize, and the way the empire had dealt with minority questions with this millet system that was a very different way, with local courts based on local religion and bodies that adjudicated based on their own culture and tradition. Not so dissimilar from some of the proposals that people now make in the multicultural literature on how to think about minority questions and cultural issues. This was the Ottoman Empire, But of course they were like, this is not good enough because we need universal contract, we need the law, we need the treaties, we need the code, the civil code, and all these things that came from this institutional model that clearly worked at a certain point in time, but then afterwards also clearly becomes, at least in this experience, regressive somehow.
And I mean, this started a kind of catastrophe, this unmixing of people, but then of course it rolls on. It's I guess you can speak about geopolitical luck and unluck, and I guess it was geopolitical unluck to be in Thessaloniki and to be in Tirana, and that, I mean, so much happened, especially Thessaloniki. It's kind of changed that city to something very, very different to all these wars and similar thing. Now, this shows, all our existence, your existence, my existence, have hang on a very, very thin thread. Because the slightest change in the past, you wouldn't have existed. And you're thinking about that too, because when you look at this horrifying treatment that your family has gone through, you do reflect on that and say, yeah, but I wouldn't have existed otherwise. So can I really complain? There's something. And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I find it very difficult. And actually, this is the first time that I had to contend with this non-identity problem in philosophy. And I never researched it when it was a philosophical question. But then somehow when I was thinking about the lives that I was coming across in the archives and discovered that, in many ways you are who you are because of these tragedies of the past. If my grandmother had not been kicked out more or less by Salonika, if she had not gone to Tirana, she would not have met my grandfather. If my grandmother had not been deported, my father would not have met my mother. So there's all these chains of events that are directly, causally responsible for your own being and your own existence. And I thought that maybe the best way to think about it is, you can't, I don't know, I find the thought that I would rather not exist than exist kind of hard.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I've been thinking too much about it.
So I think now, but I think there is maybe something you can take. So I find in the end, maybe some people who are better human beings than me would say, well, I'd rather be dead or not and never have lived.
I usually say that. I mean, if it's, let's say, what's at stake? I mean, if, I wouldn't have been around if the Holocaust hadn't happened, but surely I would sacrifice myself. Yeah,
that's what I mean. You're a better person than me. I think I somehow find that thought that there is a holding on to life that comes with this thought that you would rather be there and you would rather have the experiences that you're having. But on the other hand, what does follow for me is going back to the beginning of our conversation. What responsibilities do we have to the future, to future generations, to doing certain things, so that those people and their tragedies from which you emerged are in some ways vindicated and compensated. And there is a process that you set in motion in thinking about legacy, which is why a lot of my book is about the dead and the legacy of the dead and the dignity of the dead and how do we think about them and when do we honor someone's legacy, and how do people carry on living even when they're dead, actually, which they do through their family members who survive them, but not just that, also through culture and artists and intellectuals who are able to bring dead people into life somehow, even when they don't have any descendants. For me, these are all questions that are connected in part to this notion that maybe all the living people in one way or another are connected to these tragedies of the past. So it's not maybe there is something special about me, but I think maybe there's something special about being in this geopolitical unluck whereby you are particularly at the mercy of these forces and particularly the product of these injustices. But I think most of people living now are probably the result of some catastrophe or other happening in the past.
And other bad actions, I'm sure.
And for me, the way to get out of that thought is not to think about, okay, would I rather now humanity, since we're all the product of these great tragedies of the past, would we rather not be here at all? Or what can we do with the living people that we have now to make sure that certain tragedies are not reproduced and that there is knowledge that informs how future generations think about the present, where it becomes then a liberating thought rather than this existentially anxiety-producing thought.
I mean, if you met one of your family's persecutors, and maybe, let's say you have some power, like you can put them in jail, Wouldn't you do that rather than saying, "Oh, well," and then this person probably he says, "But you wouldn't have existed otherwise." That sounds kind of silly, huh?
I mean, first of all, I don't think that putting people in jail is a good
Ah, yeah,
answer
okay,
to anything. So I think that's just generally like the collapse of justice is where the thought that you put someone in jail actually resolves any problem.
Rehabilitation camp? No?
I mean, I had this thought, actually, I had the possibility when I was accessing the files to read, because a lot of it is based on surveillance reports, you can find out the names of the real, so usually you read the pseudonyms.
If you have family, not if you're a researcher, but if you're family.
Yeah, exactly. But you can, I mean, so that was another thing that I waived somehow. By applying as a researcher, not as a family member, I waived the right to automatically know who are the spies that had spied on my grandmother and put my grandfather in prison and so on. And again, that's because I thought, I'm not so sure that the answer is which individual is responsible for which other individual life. For me, the responsibility is to try and understand the forces that produce certain configurations of power and history, such that actually even someone like me might become complicit in a great injustice in certain moments of history. And so the question is not so much, now I need to find who did it, which is very much the dominant attitude in Albania and in all the post-communist world when it comes to these files. People think, okay, I'm going to go there and I'm going to find the real names of the collaborators, and the real names will somehow reconcile me with the past tragedies of my family. And I personally think that's because this is a kind of neoliberal logic that we are in, that says that every individual is responsible for what they do. And if you just find which individual is responsible for which other individual, there is this kind of reductionism whereby you solve the structural problem by finding the individual agents responsible. But I think it's actually much more difficult, and the process of reconciliation is much more complicated, but also more productive when it works, when you don't actually just find the individuals, but find a way of understanding how did this happen. And through the combination of a number of individual actions, but also contingencies and institutions and bystanders and complicit structures that aren't the obvious guys. And I feel like in Albania now, this pressure that we have to find the individuals is just a way of getting rid of responsibility from anyone else. So you find the culprit, and it's like a witch hunt, you find the person, you find the culprit, you find the responsible, and then that's it, you're done. Justice is done, historical injustice is overcome, now we can all live freely and happily, and it's just not true. It doesn't work like that.
So what do you think about this, another aspect of it? I mean, after communists fell in these countries, you try to, in some of those countries, you try to sort of say, give back the property to the families that own it before. Is that meaningful?
Yeah, so I mean, I was always against this. However, it's a very complicated discussion so I was against it because I think, okay, now what is done, and these are now public properties, and why should someone whose grandfather was persecuted 50 years ago go and in the name of that persecution have back this building and exclude other people who have been using the building? And I mean, this was, in my mother's case, there was a land where there was a school. And the descendants, they didn't care that there was a school and it had to be destroyed, and the countryside had one less school. They were like, well, this is my land, this is my grandfather. Interestingly, when I started the process looking for a photograph of my grandma, interestingly, these family members, they weren't that interested in finding the photos. So it was the land that had some kind of greater value. When I was going through the hoops to try and find the photographs of my grandmother, they were like, oh, you're not going to find the photographs. They've just taken them. It's just horrible. And I was thinking, and I remember saying to them, why didn't you think the same about the land? Oh, you're not going to find the land. It's too complicated. You spent decades trying to recover. So I think it's a very interesting question. Then who is in a position to say to these people, to this class, this category of people, just ignore it? Because I'm not so sure that the Albanian state or the Albanian current generation of politicians, many of which are the result of the former communist nomenclatura, like the current leadership of most of the kind of political parties, are all one way or another connected to the old regime. Yeah, okay, I agree, my mother's family, they shouldn't have their land. But I also don't think the Albanian state now is in the best position to tell them you should give up on the land. So, yeah, it's very complicated. It's complicated.
I think you're going to read a little bit about this non-identity problem that we discussed.
Let me try and find out how much I'm reading. Okay. My grandmother always assumed that blame and understanding could be separated from each other, like sheets tangled up in a restless patient's hospital bed. I wonder if she grasped the full implications of her own statement. Calling it blame makes it sound narrow and vindictive, as if we were trying to explain the mysteries of the universe with reference to demons and witches instead of mathematical equations. Yet, give blame a more noble, less tainted label, call it perhaps ascription of responsibility, and it becomes tolerable, even essential, the key to understanding the nuances of free action. Still, holding people responsible for their actions implies that there is something like free will, that we believe it's possible to make moral decisions. History, like nature, is made of patterns, and those are the patterns free human action creates. Knowing who caused what is often essential to understanding why it happened. It took many visits to the archives to grasp all this, to learn to tolerate something I found unbearable at the beginning. A question that awaited me at every turn like a tacky welcome mat at the entrance. Welcome to historical injustice. Do you want to uncover the real names of the collaborators? Know who is behind the Tribune, the March Wind, the Pelivan? Of all those random strangers who pieced together my grandmother's life story like medieval craftsmen assembling a stained glass window. One prayer, one surveillance at a time, one element in the overall design carefully slotted into place. Occasionally, a piece of glass breaks, a life is shattered. Do you want to know who it was? The archivists keep pressing me, as if naming names could somehow help to mitigate the damage. For a while, I resisted the urge to identify the informants. Not because I wasn't interested, because I believed it should be the last resort. I also wondered if my grandmother would have wanted to know, if she'd had a chance. She was the real victim, after all, even though she is now beyond needing to know. Some say the dead have interests that outlive them. They make wills, for example, and we feel obliged to honor their wishes. Sometimes I wonder if that is just what my grandmother would call une façon de dire, a way of speaking, a sort of poetic license the living use to conceal what might otherwise seem inappropriate. Our irresistible tendency to manipulate everything, to instrumentalize everyone for our projects. Everyone, including the dead. Surely, whatever harm my grandmother experienced cannot be undone. Her wishes, her delusions, are simply no more. Perhaps it is all for my sake then. Perhaps I'm the one who is owed the truth for the traumas the family experienced. Yet, I find that too difficult to grasp. I never felt personally harmed. On the contrary, if my grandmother had not decided to travel to Albania, she'd never met my grandfather, if my father had not been born, the events that led to my birth would have never occurred, and I wouldn't exist at all. In the end, my life is owed to the harm she endured. I came into being not despite, but because of it. Instead of blaming those medieval craftsmen, I suppose I ought to be grateful. That also seems perverse.
Indeed.
The repugnant conclusion.
Yeah, that's very perverse conclusion. Now, one of those decisions that one wonders about when one reads the book, it's not kind of spelled out, but it hovers there. It is why your grandfather Ashland, he never wrote to Uncle Enver Hoxha, although they know each other from student times in Paris. And Ashland also was willing to help Hoxha when he couldn't pay his rent. But Hoxha kind of refuses that for something that is easily understood in Sweden, because we are obsessed with this. Because he thought he wouldn't be free, because if Ashland had paid for him, he would be in debt to Ashland. So he said no to that. He preferred to jump over the balcony and not pay anything. But then when Ashland is, after the communist takeover, is put in prison in a very brutal way, he doesn't reach out to Uncle Enver. And one wonders why. I mean, here was the possibility of avoiding this horrific 15 years in prison.
Yeah.
So what happened? And that's one of those kind of decisions that had an enormous what's going to happen to his life.
So there's one of the epigraphs of the book that is a sentence from Immanuel Kant, Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, and it says, in the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. And there is this idea that, in this kind of tit for tat, give and take, there is always a question of dignity that underpins these transactional relations between people. And Hoxha refuses Aslan's offer to help, in part because he thinks that, you are in someone's debt, and that's about hierarchies and about power and about being at the mercy of someone's superior position who has offered you help but somehow made you dependent in offering you this help. And I think when Aslan was sent to prison, he had been also sent word that if he wrote a prayer letter or a request, kind of in Albanian we say it's a prayer, it's like an official request to Hoxha to beg to be released from prison, then maybe, if he got this to the party, that they would send it to him and he would be released. And Aslan replied saying, well, I didn't enter with a prayer, so I'm not going to want to go out with a prayer. And he refused it. But of course, he didn't know that he was going to be there for 15 years. So he assumed that, this was 1946. He thought the Albanian communist state had at most 4 years of life. And so he said, well, for 4 years, that's with the price of dignity. You take 4 years in prison, and you keep your dignity, and you are waiting for something geopolitical to happen, and maybe the communists be toppled by the intervention from the Allies and so on.
It's kind of clear they couldn't know that it would be there for 50 years.
Well, yeah, because people are, it's very interesting, this question of foreign intervention, right? Sometimes people are waiting for it and it doesn't come, and sometimes you haven't been waiting long enough and they just send you the troops right away and they solve it with these foreign powers. So he decided to stay in prison, but of course, he thought it would be 4 years, not 40. And then when he came out of prison, then he did write a letter to Hoxha.
Indeed, he did.
And actually, we have a
copy
of this letter.
But why not after 5 years or after 10 years?
Well, because this is the question, and this is the kind of philosophical question, like, does dignity have a price? Yeah. And what is the price? Is it like 4 years in prison or 15 years? Or, how do you make these calculations? Actually, a lot of the book, for me, is this is why it's my position on dignity and on moral agency generally. It's a Kantian position because it says you just stick to the principle because you can never know what the consequences of acting in a certain way are. It's really hard to calculate everything and all the counterfactuals.
That also becomes a very non-pragmatic position.
Yeah, it becomes absolutely.
You're going to sacrifice a lot for your dignity.
And in fact, the book is
a very proud idea.
Totally, and the book is a lot about how lives are ruined because of that.
Yeah.
These lives are all ruined.
That's the title
these people,
of the book.
It's a world of indignity in which you try to hold on to the principle. Every single decision you make turns out that consequentially is the wrong decision. Because, my grandmother, she refuses a Nazi offer to leave Albania. Her husband ends up in prison. The husband refuses to write a letter to Hoxha. He stays 15 years in prison rather than 15 months. So this is this chain of events whereby you hold on to the principle and somehow, the principle doesn't bear out or the consequences don't make you happy. They don't make your life go better. But this is also why, for me, this question of legacy is so important. Because for a life like that, what is the only way of vindicating that life? It's not their happiness. It's not their success. It's the responsibility of the next generation or someone who is connected to them to think about how this bears out somehow. What consequences you draw from this? What is the meaning of otherwise completely senseless life that was lived in tragedy?
But do you think that Aslan lost a bit of his dignity when he wrote the letter after coming out to get a nice job as a lawyer?
Of course he did. Yeah, sure. He should have. Since he endured 15 years in prison, the principal would have said, "Okay, now don't go begging." And I read this letter. It's very interesting. It's an example of a letter that is attempting to still be dignified, but also clearly not. Because he has to write certain things. So he writes in this letter, I've been 15 years in prison, I've recognized, the things that I have done, and I feel like I've paid my dues to the Albanian state. In these 15 years, I've recognized the progress of the Albanian state in certain domains, education or, literacy. And when I read that letter, it's really hard to know, does he really mean what he's saying? It's true that the Albanians did lots of progress with literacy in those 15 years. It was 97% illiterate and then it was much less so. And so there were some objective factors that he was pointing toward. Or was he saying certain things because this maximized his chances of getting a position? And And it was very strange because he became a lawyer, someone who is a political prisoner and comes out and becomes a lawyer. But then again, there were further compromises that he could have made, which he decided not to. So once someone like that came out of prison and were nominated as lawyer, he had the choice of, he was asked, do you want to be in Tirana or stay in the countryside, deported where they were? And he refused to go to the capital because he thought that if you went to the capital, you would become an informant. You would be, this is the automatic next thing, that if you're there, they will call you and they will ask you, okay, can you now spy on other people? So this is where he again drew the line of principle. So of course he could have had an even better life in Tirana and decided, to stay in this very small, miserable house that they had and very far remote from everything. And that was a principle that he was defending. I don't want to collaborate with the system. So I've taken this offer. I've compromised up to this point, but not up to this other point. And this is sort of interesting, I think.
No, I understand it. I think I'm on the opposite. I think pride is something that we should perhaps get rid of to just do the best thing.
But it's not really about pride in this case, because being a collaborator, is what you're doing to other people. So it's about ruining someone else's life.
That I agree with. But I think about not writing this letter from the beginning.
Yeah, but maybe he thought at the beginning that writing this letter would have meant becoming a collaborator then. Right. So, it's just all these things that you just cannot know the consequences. And this is why, as I said, the book is all this, and it's also interesting what literature can do. These are questions that you can't quite, if you're trying to explore them from a philosophical perspective in a philosophical paper, it's really hard to unpack them and articulate them. But if you show it in a life, what does dignity mean? In this context, in these circumstances, by these people and these lives, there are some tools that literature gives you that you don't really get from other sources somehow.
I'm going to move to something else, namely a kind of meta level about the method that you use to write this book. And of course, it's based on your family's history, but a lot of it is fiction too. And I'm an extremely gullible person, especially when it's a good book that pulls me in. So I believe everything, even though I actually had heard you talking about this. And also, of course, I don't know. For example, this Gustaf of course, when I read the book, I thought it was a real person. But then I realized you named him Gustaf, which is kind of worrying me a little bit. Since he's a horrible person. I mean, he's this Nazi.
He's not horrible throughout.
Yeah, but it gets worse and worse.
He has some redeeming features. Very end.
So, and then I wonder about this. It's very hard for me, of course, and for any reader to know what is fiction and what is reality. Yeah. And so it's not like it's a little bit like a docudrama or something like conjectural documentary or something like that. Could you tell me a bit more how you decided to do it this way?
Yeah. So I mean, the first thing to say is that's fully intentional. That you are not meant to know whether it's fiction or non-fiction. And also that you actually go away from the book thinking, what did I read? Did I read just someone's creation, or did I read something that was based on facts? And I resisted my editors who wanted me to write a methodological afterward to explain how I did it, just like I resisted having photos in the book. But that's because I had this my thinking was the following. I started with the archives and with the facts and the files. And I entered these archives and I discovered that what I was reading was often things that were manipulated. I was reading someone else's creation, like the spy's creation.
Yeah, they're not facts, actually. They are.
Well, they are. Yeah. I mean, they are. In some ways, they are facts, but the facts have been ordered in a way that certain things are not. It's more about what is left out, actually, rather than what they say. I mean, what they say is often based on facts, one way or another. But what's interesting is what you can't read about. So in Albania, there's all this discussion around how did they surveil people? What did they add? What did they take out? Sometimes the surveillance officers, and this came very clearly from my grandmother's file, it was very clear that there were cases where they were trying to save her, and so they would not report certain things, or they would report things like she was a very committed communist, and knowing my grandmother, I knew she was not a very committed communist. So this was clearly wrong.
But there was two of them.
Then, so then we went to I went to the archives in Greece. And I was trying to search the Ottoman Empire, and I was told, but the Ottoman Empire, there is no evidence from the Ottoman Empire, because this is all the Greek state has created an account of the history of Salonika that wants to give the impression to the observers or the researchers that this was always a Greek city where the largest group were Greeks, and the Greeks called the shots, and the Greeks shaped the history. And actually, it's not true. The Sephardic Jews were the largest group in the city. And so it was so you realize that at every stage or in Italy, I was doing research about the fascist period, And I was told, women, it's really hard if you can research the uncle or the brother, or it's very hard to find evidence on women because they weren't juridical subjects up to a certain point. So I discovered that these archives, there was a kind of creative force in the archive that was shaping the documentary evidence in a way that wanted to convey a certain impression to the reader about what was important, what was not important, that concealed certain things. And that there were all these gray areas or black areas where you couldn't find out anything. But what you could find were just fragments of lives. So you could find a little bit, like you'd find a letter, an exchange between a woman and her cousin, or you could find the Holocaust survivor's memoir, or you can read in the newspapers of the period some transaction about a shop that was being sold, and so on. So you just get these fragments of lives, but not unified characters. And that's where I thought, so there is the archive here that is giving me a fiction, anyway. And then there maybe is a fictional approach to the archive, that is what literature does, which puts together all these fragments of lives and puts them in one character, so merges these hybrid fragments and put them in one character, and creates characters, all of which are based on true details. So for example, and this turned out to be actually horribly difficult to write, because, this character, Gustaf, yes, I invented the name, but I invented the name by searching what was the most popular name for 1920s German businessman. And it turned out that Gustaf was the most popular name in Germany in the 1920s.
With V, though, that's good.
With a V. And then everything I write about, so he's a tobacco trader who goes from Hamburg. He's born in a northern city in Germany and goes to the Ottoman, to Salonika, because he wants to rekindle a tobacco business that his family had with the Ottoman Empire. There was a very important tobacco center near Salonika called Kavala, where there were trade links between the Ottomans and the Germans. And
the Swedes.
After World War I, after the Versailles Treaty, the tobacco business in Germany has really been struggling, and as part of the effort to kind of, and in part because of competition with American tobacco companies, so Philip Morris and so on, so all these German smaller owners that had these links with the Ottoman Empire are in real difficulty. So all of that story is all based on archival research and on, newspaper cuttings, PhD thesis on tobacco trade, the Dresden-Hamburg Railway, and links to the Ottoman Empire. So this actually became crazy, the amount of historical evidence that you need to process, and it makes its way into this fictional character. But as I say, everything I say about that character is true, and historians who read this, they see that it's research on the tobacco trade, and now this is a very small part of the story. It's not the largest bit. There is a whole bit where I went down a complete rabbit hole that survived only in the form of 2 sentences. Which was the leech trade between Salonika and the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans were obsessed with leeches for curative purposes, and then at some point there was a whole new conception of the leeches went kind of, and somehow I made a mistake because I thought the period I was studying, this was still relevant, but then it turned out the leech trade had been 30 years before, and when I was researching it, it was already in decline. So after I spent a month studying leeches and leech farms and leech jars and trying to look at photos of what these leech jars looked like, and it turned out that I only needed 1 sentence in the books. but everything, if I say the wedding dress was bought in this shop, the shop really was there at that time and really sold those kinds of wedding dresses. Or if I say, Lehmann and her aunt went and drank cognac from these red glasses at Ataturk, also the red glasses really were there, and Ataturk really drank from that, and the patisserie is still there. And you should have seen my joy when I actually saw it in Salonika, this patisserie that I've been reading for decades. So.
Yeah, and did this kind of background investigation that you did that make you understand your family, the real family, more? Because you start to get more knowledge about how they lived and what they cared about.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to your, what you were saying, which was conjectural history. So in a way, I think the archive gives you the facts, and it gives you this creation, and it also gives you the propaganda and the manipulation of one authority. And now literature has this alternative authority that, reads the facts and reads a lot of facts and multiple sources so that you can put together these different perspectives. From what I think is this conjectural perspective of trying to think about values and something that the archive, or values from an impartial perspective, let's say. So the archive gives you the values from the point of view of the authorities in power, and literatures try to dismantle those authorities by thinking about alternative power and alternative construction, and a fiction that I think from a moral perspective is more true than the truth of the archive. So did it give me the truth of my family? In some ways, yes, and in some ways no. It didn't give me the more factual truth, but I think it made me understand better certain dynamics. So it made me understand better not my grandmother's life, but the forces that led to this ruin and that led to this life going a certain way. And those forces, when I was a child, when she spoke of the population exchange, she would say, "Oh, this is the greatest disaster of my life." And I always thought, what is even population exchange? What does it mean? You know, you can't even get your head around how does it work, population exchange. Then I went and read so much about the population exchange and how it worked with legally and with the properties that were confiscated in one place and were restituted in another country. And so you understand the dynamics of it and how complicated it is for individuals. And that made me understand, okay, now I see why my grandmother was so obsessed with the population exchange. And if you don't do this untangling historical work, then you don't, you understand, the fact was the same. I knew that she was troubled by the population exchange, but my understanding of the facts was much better after I had done the research. And I hope that this is also what the book achieves with the readers, that although there are a lot of facts and a lot of details and a lot of dates and these countries that not everyone knows about because they're not, go-to history, you still, by reading them, get a sense of and a detail, and you get a sense of an era that replaces another era and all the conflicts that come with it, and how they are also politically shaped and manipulated.
Very good. I mean, I can ask many more questions, but I think we have some time for questions from the audience, if you're prepared for that.
Yeah, definitely.
So we have a microphone somewhere? Oh. Okay, Felicia.
Yeah, so I was wondering, you were speaking quite a lot about how, we need to look at the past in order to take responsibility for the future. So I was wondering, from the work with the book, what are some of the kind of key conclusions that you have? Maybe also in relation to what you started the conversations with, this notion of the nation state that is ethnically pure versus other types of political formations, and how you see that changing in the future.
Yeah, so I guess the one of the questions, I mean, there are several, but one of the things that was really important for me was in how to think about migration now. And again, it's not something that you can kind of draw straight lessons from history. And also it's not the case, I think, that people say history repeats itself. It doesn't repeat itself always in the same way. And the question is, what work does this sentence, history repeats itself, do when you're thinking about the present? But for me, the most important thing that I took away from these analogies with the 1920s and 30s was how easy it is for minorities to be scapegoated when there is a global crisis of the kind that there was in Europe between 1920 and 1930, and that enabled the rise of nationalist and then fascist politicians, and this instrumentalization of the nation-state principle to then deport and exclude and scapegoat and blame people who were belonging to these cultural other groups. So for me, I mean, of course, I've always been working on migration and I was always really interested, but this connection between, there's a financial crisis, the 1929 Wall Street crash, that leads into geopolitical crisis that produces, trade war, tariff wars, deglobalization, protectionism. And I was reading about this with regard to the tobacco business and what the effects this had. But as I was reading, this was when Trump was deciding on tariffs and, putting tariffs on other countries, and how then you see this crisis that is clearly has socioeconomic sources, but in the absence of a socioeconomic analysis gets manipulated by these far-right or nationalist politicians, and then it becomes, as Gustaf, my Nazi character, says, this is, the Jews who are unfairly competing with Germans, and the Jews who have special cultural exemptions because they can trade on these days and we can't trade on those days. And so then all these kind of identity issues become manipulated and used in the service of responding to a conflict that is not about identity. Because people clearly lived there for centuries, and nobody was bothered by what the Jews were doing on Saturday and what the Muslims were doing on Eid and so on. And suddenly this becomes, in the new Greek nation state, all the rage of we can't have those schools that do certain things, and this becomes an issue. Same thing in Paris. There's a part of it, the story that's in the Popular Front years, this is all the discussion is about why should the professions be open to doctors and lawyers that are Jewish and not to French citizens, because there were the beginnings of waves of migrants from Germany to France. So 1933, anti-Semitism in Germany takes hold, and they have a lot of migrants from Germany to France, and migrants are often, the Jewish migrants are educated, middle-class Jews who compete and who have, doctors and lawyers in these professions. And again, I was reading this as Marine Le Pen was saying, we should close the state offices to immigrant second generation. So you really see how this begins to slowly trickle, and then eventually, now we think about Second World War, we think about Auschwitz. But if you think about the forces that lead to the escalation of those kinds of geopolitical conflicts, that made me think about migration very differently. And made me think that one of the problems is this manipulation of membership and the idea that membership is the answer as opposed to something else that could be the answer.
On that note, join me in thanking Lea for coming here again. And I strongly recommend the book if you haven't read it. It's amazing. I'm not going to make a comparison to the first book. They're both very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.